To understand this, we need to take a step back and look at where this idea of infrastructure-led growth came from. What made leaders and experts believe that building more was a solution? And how has this strategy played out in Africa over the last 2 decades? Only by tracing the history and examining the results can we begin to uncover the truth and figure out what should be next for Africa's future. The story begins with a man named John Perkins and his blockbuster book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which revealed the shocking truth behind the infrastructure-led development model and who it really benefits. John Perkins is not a name you hear every day, but his story might just make you question everything you knew about how the world works. In 2004, he published a book with a title that practically dared you to pick it up, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It sounded like a spy thriller, but what Perkins claimed inside wasn't fiction. It was a first-hand account of how wealthy nations and global institutions like the World Bank used infrastructure development as a tool not to help countries grow, but to trap them in cycles of debt and dependence. Perkins described himself as a former economic hitman, whose official role was a consultant at a Boston-based consulting firm called Maine in the 1970s and 80s. Economic hitmen, or EHMs, are highly paid professionals who work behind the scenes to manipulate developing countries. Their goal? To funnel massive amounts of money from global organizations like the World Bank and USAID straight into the pockets of big corporations and a handful of wealthy elites who control natural resources. They do this by persuading nations to take on huge loans for infrastructure projects, promising it will lead to growth and prosperity, but in reality, these loans often leave countries drowning in debt and at the mercy of those who lent them the money. According to Perkins, his role as an EHM was not about helping countries grow or improve their economies. Instead, it was about securing US economic and political interests by pushing developing nations into massive debt. This was done under the guise of foreign aid or partnerships funded by institutions like the World Bank and USAID. The goal was clear: tie these countries to debt they couldn't repay and use that financial leverage to control their resources, policies, and governments. Perkins described how the process worked. Leaders of developing nations were encouraged to join a global network of power serving US commercial and political interests. Sometimes, that encouragement came as lucrative payoffs. Other times, it was blackmail, and in some cases, even threats to their lives. The target was never just the leaders though. They were merely the entry point. The real aim, according to Perkins, was to enslave entire countries under mountains of debt while claiming to uplift their economies. In his book, Perkins reveals how he and his team would create sophisticated economic projections to convince governments to take on loans for massive infrastructure projects, dams, highways, airports, and industrial parks. These models were designed to look like they would guarantee economic growth, but Perkins admits their true purpose was manipulation, and as he put it, the numbers were impressive but misleading. They justified loans that would funnel billions into the hands of corporations while leaving the countries burdened with debt they couldn't manage. Perkins shares a striking example from his time in Jakarta, where he had to develop economic forecasts that would support the construction of a costly, expansive electric grid. Since electricity is seen as an essential for development, he was tasked with selling a dream of spectacular economic growth if the government invested in this project built by a Western contractor and funded by debt. His instructions from the top of Maine, the consulting company he worked for, were clear. Inflate projections to predict at least 17% growth, even though historical data suggested that 6 to 9% was more realistic. If the government agreed to the project, the contractors would secure substantial profits boosting their stock prices and enriching their shareholders and executives. The convincing process could involve bribery, threats, or even blackmail, but the outcome was the same. Corporations thrived on the corruptibility of many leaders in developing countries, leaders who are often willing to trade the future prosperity of their people for personal gain. Economic hitmen would further push governments to purchase more products and services from Western companies, such as computer systems, medicines, tractors, and aircraft, all under the guise of development. While the GDP of the indebted nation might rise due to these projects, the benefits often stay within the circles of politically connected elites who own banks, hotels, and industries that directly benefit from the new infrastructure. What made this system so effective, Perkins explains, is that it was backed by the world's most powerful institutions. The World Bank, the IMF, and other international organizations gave the process credibility. Their stated mission of reducing poverty and fostering global development made the loans seem altruistic, but in reality, these institutions reinforced economic dependence and inequality, propping up a global system that benefited the wealthy at the expense of the poor. It's a system that sounds almost too calculated to be real, an empire built not with armies, but with contracts, spreadsheets, and empty promises. Perkins' revelations are a dark reminder of how noble-sounding ideals can be weaponized to serve the interest of a select few. For Africa, where infrastructure-led development has been the dominant strategy for decades, Perkins' story raises uncomfortable questions. If so much of this development model was based on flawed or self-serving economic ideology, how much of Africa's infrastructure boom has really been about progress, and how much of it has been about control? To understand what's happening in Africa today, Perkins' story is a crucial piece of the puzzle. His experiences give us a lens to view the decisions of global powers and their impact on developing nations. Let's dive deeper and see how the patterns Perkins exposed decades ago still echo in Africa's modern-day quest for growth and prosperity. Hey, if you like that video, click somewhere to the right of your screen to watch the full unfiltered version. All the best and thank you.